Section 13 of Tales of Three Hemispheres. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ed Humpal. Beyond the Fields We Know. First Tale. Idle Days on the Yann. So I came down through the wood to the bank of Yann and found, as had been prophesied, the ship Bird of the River about to loose her cable. The captain sat cross-legged upon the white deck with his scimitar lying beside him in its jewelled scabbard, and the sailors toiled to spread the nimble sails to bring the ship into the central stream of Yann, and all the while sang ancient soothing songs. And the wind of the evening, descending cool from the snowfields of some mountainous abode of distant gods, came suddenly, like glad tidings to an anxious city, into the wing-like sails. And so we came into the central stream, whereat the sailors lowered the greater sails. But I had gone to bow before the captain, to inquire concerning the miracles and appearances among men of the most holy gods of whatever land he had come from. And the captain answered that he came from fair Belzoond, and worshipped gods that were the least and humblest, who seldom sent the famine or the thunder, and were easily appeased with little battles. And I told how I had come from Ireland, which is of Europe, whereat the captain and all the sailors laughed, for they said, there are no such places in all the land of dreams. When they had ceased to mock me, I explained that my fancy mostly dwelt in the desert of Cuparnumbo, about a beautiful city called Golgoth the Damned, which was sentinelled all around by wolves and their shadows, and had been utterly desolate for years and years, because of a curse which the gods once spoke in anger, and could never since recall. And sometimes my dreams took me as far as Pungarviz, the red-walled city where the fountains are, which trades with the Isles and Thule. When I said this, they complimented me upon the abode of my fancy, saying that, though they had never seen these cities, such places might well be imagined. For the rest of that evening I bargained with the captain over the sum that I should pay him for my fare if God and the tide of Yann should bring us safely as far as the cliffs by the sea, which are named Bar Wul Yann, the gate of Yann. And now the sun had set, and all the colours of the world and heaven held a festival with him, and slipped one by one away before the imminent approach of night. The parrots had all flown home to the jungle on either bank, the monkeys in rows in safety on high branches of the trees were silent and asleep, the fireflies in the deeps of the forest were going up and down, and the great stars came gleaming out to look on the face of Yann. Then the sailors lighted lanterns, and hung them round the ship, and the light flashed out on a sudden and dazzled Yann, and the ducks that fed along his marshy banks all suddenly arose, and made wide circles in the upper air, and saw the distant reaches of the Yann, and the white mist that softly cloaked the jungle, before they returned again into their marshes. And then the sailors knelt on the decks and prayed, not all together, but 5 or 6 at a time. Side by side there kneeled down together 5 or 6, for there only prayed at the same time men of different faiths, so that no god should hear 2 men praying to him at once. As soon as any one had finished his prayer, another of the same faith would take his place. Thus knelt the row of 5 or 6 with bended heads under the fluttering sail, while the central stream of the river Yann took them on towards the sea, and their prayers rose up from among the lanterns and went towards the stars. And behind them, in the after end of the ship, the helmsman prayed aloud the helmsman's prayer, which is prayed by all who follow his trade upon the river Yann, of whatever faith they be. And the captain prayed to his little lesser gods, to the gods that bless Belzoond. And I too felt that I would pray, Yet I liked not to pray to a jealous God, there where the frail, affectionate gods whom the heathen love were being humbly invoked. So I bethought me instead of Sheol Nugganoth, whom the men of the jungle have long since deserted, who is now unworshipped and alone, and to him I prayed. And upon us praying the night came suddenly down, as it comes upon all men who pray at evening, and upon all men who do not. Yet our prayers comforted our own souls when we thought of the great night to come. And so Yann bore us magnificently onwards, for he was elate with molten snow that the Poltiades had brought him from the hills of Hap, and the Marm and the Migris were swollen full with floods, and he bore us in his might past Kif and Pir, and we saw the lights of Gulunza. Soon we all slept, except the helmsman, who kept the ship in the midstream of Yann. When the sun rose the helmsman ceased to sing, for by song he cheered himself in the lonely night. When the song ceased, we suddenly all awoke, and another took the helm, and the helmsman slept. We knew that soon we should come to Mandaroon. We made a meal, and Mandaroon appeared. Then the captain commanded, and the sailors loosed again the greater sails, and the ship turned and left the stream of Yann and came into a harbour beneath the ruddy walls of Mandaroon. Then, while the sailors went and gathered fruits, I came alone to the gate of Mandaroon. A few huts were outside it, in which lived the guard. A sentinel, with a long white beard, was standing in the gate, armed with a rusty pike. He wore large spectacles, which were covered with dust. Through the gate I saw the city. A deathly stillness was over all of it. The ways seemed untrodden, and moss was thick on doorsteps. In the marketplace huddled figures lay asleep. A scent of incense and burned poppies, and there was a hum of the echoes of distant bells. I said to the sentinel, in the tongue of the region of Yann, "Why are they all asleep in this still city?" He answered, "None may ask questions in this gate for fear they wake the people of the city. For when the people of this city wake, the gods will die. And when the gods die, men may dream no more." And I began to ask him what gods that city worshipped, but he lifted his pike, because none might ask questions there. So I left him and went back to the Bird of the River. Certainly Mandaroon was beautiful, with her white pinnacles peering over her ruddy walls, and the green of her copper roofs. When I came back again to the Bird of the River, I found the sailors were returned to the ship. Soon we weighed anchor and sailed out again, and so came once more to the middle of the river. And now the sun was moving toward his heights, and there had reached us on the river Yann the song of those countless myriads of choirs that attend him in his progress around the world. For the little creatures that have many legs had spread their gauze wings easily on the air, as a man rests his elbows on a balcony, and gave jubilant, ceremonial praises to the sun. Or else they moved together on the air in wavering dances, intricate and swift, or turned aside to avoid the onrush of some drop of water that a breeze had shaken from a jungle orchid, chilling the air and driving it before it as it fell whirring in its rush to the earth. But all the while they sang triumphantly. "For the day is for us," they said, "whether our great and sacred father the sun shall bring up more life like us from the marshes, or whether all the world shall end tonight." And there sang all those whose notes are known to human ears, as well as those whose far more numerous notes have never been heard by man. To these a rainy day had been as an era of war that should desolate continents during all the lifetime of a man. And there came out also from the dark and steaming jungle to behold and rejoice in the sun the huge and lazy butterflies. And they danced, but danced idly, on the ways of the air, as some haughty queen of distant conquered lands might in her poverty and exile dance, in some encampment of the gypsies, for the mere bread to live by, but beyond that would never abate her pride to dance for a fragment more. And the butterflies sung of strange and painted things, of purple orchids and of lost pink cities, and the monstrous colours of the jungle's decay. And they too were among those whose voices are not discernible by human ears. And as they floated above the river, going from forest to forest, their splendour was matched by the inimical beauty of the birds who darted out to pursue them. Or sometimes they settled on the white and wax-like blooms of the plant that creeps and clamours about the trees of the forest, and their purple wings flashed out on the great blossoms as, when the caravans go from Nurl to Thace, the gleaming silks flash out upon the snow, where the crafty merchants spread them one by one to astonish the mountaineers of the hills of Nur. But upon men and beasts the sun sent a drowsiness. The river monsters along the river's marge lay dormant in the slime. The sailors pitched a pavilion with golden tassels for the captain upon the deck, and then went, all but the helmsman, under a sail that they had hung as an awning between two masts. Then they told tales to one another, each of his own city or of the miracles of his god, until all were fallen asleep. The captain offered me the shade of his pavilion with the gold tassels, and there we talked for a while, he telling me that he was taking merchandise to Perdóndaris, and that he would take back to fair Belzoond things appertaining to the affairs of the sea. Then, as I watched through the pavilion's opening the brilliant birds and butterflies that crossed and recrossed over the river, I fell asleep, and dreamed that I was a monarch entering his capital underneath arches of flags, and all the musicians of the world were there, playing melodiously their instruments, but no one cheered. In the afternoon, as the day grew cooler again, I awoke and found the captain buckling on his scimitar, which he had taken off him while he rested. And now we were approaching the wide court of Astahahn, which opens upon the river. Strange boats of antique design were chained there to the steps. As we neared it we saw the open marble court, on three sides of which stood the city fronting on colonnades. And in the court and along the colonnades the people of that city walked in solemnity and care, according to the rites of ancient ceremony. All in that city was of ancient device. The carving on the houses, which, when age had broken it, remained unrepaired, was of the remotest times, and everywhere were represented in stone beasts that have long since passed away from earth, the dragon, the griffin, the hippogriffin, and the different species of gargoyle. Nothing was to be found, whether material or custom, that was new to Astahahn. Now they took no notice at all of us as we went by, but continued their processions and ceremonies in the ancient city, and the sailors, knowing their custom, took no notice of them. But I called, as we came near, to one who stood beside the water's edge, asking him what men did in Astahahn, and what their merchandise was, and with whom they traded. He said, "Here we have fettered and manacled Time, who would otherwise slay the gods." I asked him what gods they worshipped in that city, and he said, "All those gods whom Time has not yet slain." Then he turned from me and would say no more, but busied himself in behaving in accordance with ancient custom. And so, according to the will of Yann, we drifted onwards and left Astahahn, and we found in greater quantities such birds as prey on fishes, and they were very wonderful in their plumage, and they came not out of the jungle, but flew, with their long necks stretched out before them, and their legs lying on the wind behind, straight up the river over the midstream. And now the evening began to gather in. A thick white mist had appeared over the river and was softly rising higher. It clutched at the trees with long, impalpable arms. It rose higher and higher, chilling the air, and white shapes moved away into the jungle as though the ghosts of shipwrecked mariners were searching stealthily in the darkness for the spirits of evil that long ago had wrecked them on the Yann. As the sun sank behind the field of orchids that grew on the matted summit of the jungle, the river monsters came wallowing out of the slime in which they had reclined during the heat of the day, and the great beasts of the jungle came down to drink. The butterflies a while since were gone to rest. In little narrow tributaries that we passed night seemed already to have fallen, though the sun which had disappeared from us had not yet set. And now the birds of the jungle came flying home far over us, with the sunlight glistening pink upon their breasts, and lowered their pinions as soon as they saw the Yann, and dropped into the trees. And the widgeon began to go up the river in great companies, all whistling, and then would suddenly wheel and all go down again. And there shot by us the small and arrow-like teal, and we heard the manifold cries of flocks of geese, which the sailors told me had recently come in from crossing over the Lispasian ranges. Every year they came by the same way, close by the peak of Maluna, leaving it to the left, and the mountain eagles know the way they come and, men say, the very hour, and every year they expect them by the same way as soon as the snows have fallen upon the northern plains. But soon it grew so dark that we saw these birds no more, and only heard the whirring of their wings, and of countless others besides, until they all settled down along the banks of the river, and it was the hour when the birds of the night went forth. Then the sailors lit the lanterns for the night, and huge moths appeared, flapping about the ship, and at moments their gorgeous colours would be revealed by the lanterns, then they would pass into the night again, where all was black. And again the sailors prayed, and thereafter we supped and slept, and the helmsman took our lives into his care. When I awoke I found that we had indeed come to Perdóndaris, the famous city. For there it stood on the left of us, a city fair and notable, and all the more pleasant for our eyes to see after the jungle that was so long with us. And we were anchored by the marketplace, and the captain's merchandise was all displayed, and a merchant of Perdóndaris stood looking at it. And the captain had his scimitar in his hand, and was beating with it in anger upon the deck, and the splinters were flying up from the white planks, for the merchant had offered him a price for his merchandise that the captain declared to be an insult to himself and his country's gods, whom he now said to be great and terrible gods, whose curses were to be dreaded. But the merchant waved his hands, which were of great fatness, showing his pink palms, and swore that of himself he thought not at all, but only of the poor folk in the huts beyond the city, to whom he wished to sell the merchandise for as low a price as possible, leaving no remuneration for himself. For the merchandise was mostly the thick tumarund carpets that in the winter keep the wind from the floor, and tolab, which the people smoke in pipes. Therefore the merchant said if he offered a piffek more, the poor folk must go without their tumaruns when the winter came, and without their tolab in the evenings, or else he and his aged father must starve together. Thereat the captain lifted his scimitar to his own throat, saying that he was now a ruined man, and that nothing remained to him but death. And while he was carefully lifting his beard with his left hand, the merchant eyed the merchandise again, and said that rather than see so worthy a captain die, a man for whom he had conceived an especial love when he first saw the manner in which he had handled his ship, he and his aged father should starve together, and therefore he offered 15 piffeks more. When he said this the captain prostrated himself, and prayed to his gods that they might yet sweeten this merchant's bitter heart, to his little lesser gods, to the gods that bless Belzoond. At last The merchant offered yet 5 piffeks more. Then the captain wept, for he said he was deserted of his gods, and the merchant also wept, for he said that he was thinking of his aged father, and of how soon he would starve. And he hid his weeping face with both his hands, and eyed the tollub again between his fingers. And so the bargain was concluded, and the merchant took the tumerund and the tollub, paying for them out of a great clinking purse. And these were packed up into bales again, and 3 of the merchant's slaves carried them upon their heads into the city. And all the while the sailors had sat silent, cross-legged in a crescent upon the deck, eagerly watching the bargain. And now a murmur of satisfaction arose among them, and they began to compare it among themselves with other bargains that they had known. And I found out from them that there are 7 merchants in Perdóndaris, and that they had all come to the captain one by one before the bargaining began, and each had warned privately against the others. And to all the merchants the captain had offered the wine of his own country that they make in fair Belzoond, but could in no wise persuade them to it. But now that the bargain was over, and the sailors were seated at the first meal of the day, the captain appeared among them with a cask of that wine, and we broached it with care, and all made merry together. And the captain was glad in his heart, because he knew that he had much honour in the eyes of his men, because of the bargain that he had made. So the sailors drank the wine of their native land, and soon their thoughts were back in fair Belzoond, and the little neighbouring cities of Durl and Duz. But for me the captain poured into a little glass some heavy yellow wine from a small jar which he kept apart among his sacred things. Thick and sweet it was, even like honey, yet there was in its heart a mighty ardent fire, which had authority over souls of men. It was made, the captain told me, with great subtlety by the secret craft of a family of 6 who lived in a hut on the mountains of Yann. Once, in these mountains, he said, he followed the spoor of a bear, and he came suddenly on a man of that family who had hunted the same bear, and he was at the end of a narrow way with precipice all about him, and his spear was sticking in the bear, the wound not fatal, and he had no other weapon. And the bear was walking towards the man very slowly, because his wound irked him, yet he was now very close. And what the captain did he would not say. But every year, as soon as the snows are hard, and travelling is easy on the Yann, that man comes down to the market in the plains, and always leaves for the captain, in the gate of fair Belzoond, a vessel of that priceless secret wine. And as I sipped the wine and the captain talked, I remembered me of stalwart noble things that I had long since resolutely planned, and my soul seemed to grow mightier within me, and to dominate the whole tide of the Yann. It may be that I then slept. Or if I did not, I do not now minutely recollect every detail of that morning's occupations. Towards evening I awoke, and wishing to see Perdóndaris before we left in the morning, and being unable to wake the captain, I went ashore alone. Certainly Perdóndaris was a powerful city. It was encompassed by a wall of great strength and altitude, having in it hollow ways for troops to walk in, and battlements along it all the way, and 15 strong towers on it every mile, and copper plaques low down where men could read them, telling in all the languages of those parts of the earth, 1 language on each plaque, the tale of how an army once attacked Perdóndaris and what befell that army. Then I entered Perdóndaris, and found all the people dancing, clad in brilliant silks, and playing on the tambang as they danced. For a fearful thunderstorm had terrified them while I slept, and the fires of death, they said, had danced over Perdóndaris, and now the thunder had gone leaping away, large and black and hideous, they said, over the distant hills, and had turned around snarling at them, showing his gleaming teeth, and had stamped, as he went, upon the hilltops until they rang as though they had been of bronze. And often and again they stopped in their merry dances and prayed to the God they knew not, saying, O God that we know not, we thank thee for sending the thunder back to his hills. And I went on, and came to the marketplace, and lying there upon the marble pavement, I saw the merchant fast asleep and breathing heavily, with his face and palms of his hands toward the sky, and slaves were fanning him to keep away the flies. And from the marketplace I came to a silver temple, and then to a palace of onyx, and there were many wonders in Perdóndaris, and I would have stayed and seen them all, but as I came to the outer wall of the city, I suddenly saw in it a huge ivory gate. For a while I paused and admired it. Then I came nearer and perceived the dreadful truth. The gate was carved out of one solid piece. I fled at once through the gateway and down to the ship, and even as I ran I thought that I heard far off on the hills behind me the tramp of the fearful beast by whom that mass of ivory was shed, who was perhaps even then looking for his other tusk. When I was on the ship again I felt safer, and I said nothing to the sailors of what I had seen. And now the captain was gradually awakening. Now night was rolling up from the east and north, and only the pinnacles of the towers of Perdóndaris still took the fallen sunlight. Then I went to the captain and told him quietly of the thing I had seen, and he questioned me at once about the gate in a low voice that the sailors might not know. And I told him how the weight of the thing was such that it could not have been brought from afar, and the captain knew that it had not been there a year ago. We agreed that such a beast could never have been killed by any assault of man, and that the gate must have been a fallen tusk, and one fallen near and recently. Therefore he decided that it were better to flee at once. So he commanded, and the sailors went to the sails, and others raised the anchor to the deck, and just as the highest pinnacle of marble lost the last rays of the sun, we left Perdóndaris, that famous city. And night came down and cloaked Perdóndaris and hid it from our eyes, which, as things have happened, will never see it again. For I have heard since that something swift and wonderful has suddenly wrecked Perdóndaris in a day, towers and walls and people. And the night deepened over the river Yann, a night all white with stars. And with the night there arose the helmsman's song. As soon as he had prayed, he began to sing, to cheer himself all through the lonely night. But first he prayed, praying the helmsman's prayer. And this is what I remember of it, rendered into English with a very feeble equivalent of the rhythm that seems so resonant in those tropic nights. To whatever God may hear, wherever there be sailors, whether of river or sea, whether their way be dark or whether through storm, whether their perils be of beast or of rock, or from enemy lurking on land or pursuing on sea, wherever the tiller is cold or the helmsman stiff, wherever sailors sleep or helmsmen watch, guard, guide, and return us to the old land that has known us, to the far homes that we know, to all the gods that are, to whatever God may hear. So he prayed, and there was silence, and the sailors laid them down to rest for the night. The silence deepened, and was only broken by the ripples of Yann that lightly touched our prow. Sometimes some monster of the river coughed. Silence and ripples, ripples and silence again. And then his loneliness came upon the helmsman, and he began to sing. And he sang the market songs of Durl and Duz, and the old dragon legends of Belzund. Many a song he sang, telling to spacious and exotic Yann the little tales and trifles of his city of Durl. And the songs welled up over the black jungle, and came into the clear cold air above, and the great bands of stars that looked on Yann began to know the affairs of Durl and Duz, and of the shepherds that dwelt in the fields between, and the flocks that they had, and the loves that they had loved, and all the little things that they had hoped to do. And as I lay wrapped up in skins and blankets, listening to those songs, watching the fantastic shapes of the great trees, like to black giants stalking through the night, I suddenly fell asleep. When I awoke, great mists were trailing away from the Yann, and the flow of the river was tumbling now tumultuously, and little waves appeared. For Yann had scented from afar the ancient crags of Glorm, and knew that their ravines lay cool before him, wherein he should meet the merry, wild Irilion, rejoicing from fields of snow. So he shook off from him the torpid sleep that had come upon him in the hot and scented jungle, and forgot its orchids and its butterflies, and swept on turbulent, expectant, strong, and soon the snowy peaks of the hills of Glorm came glittering into view. And now the sailors were waking up from sleep. Soon we all ate, and then the helmsman laid him down to sleep, while a comrade took his place, and they all spread over him their choicest furs. And in a while we heard the sound that the Irilion made as she came down dancing from the fields of snow. And then we saw the ravine in the hills of Glorm lying precipitous and smooth before us, into which we were carried by the leaps of Yann. And now we left the steamy jungle and breathed the mountain air. The sailors stood up and took deep breaths of it, and thought of their own far off Acrocian hills, on which were Durl and Duz. Below them in the plain stands fair Belzoond. A great shadow brooded between the cliffs of Glorm, but the crags were shining above us like gnarled moons, and almost lit the gloom. Louder and louder came the Irilion's song, and the sound of her dancing down from the fields of snow. And soon we saw her white and full of mists, and wreathed with rainbows delicate and small that she had plucked up near the mountain summit from some celestial garden of the sun. Then she went away seawards, with the huge grey Yann, and the ravine widened, and opened upon the world, and our rocking ship came through to the light of day. And all that morning and all the afternoon we passed through the marshes of Pondoovery, and Yann widened there, and flowed solemnly and slowly, and the captain bade the sailors beat on bells to overcome the dreariness of the marshes. At last the Erusian mountains came in sight, nursing the villages of Penkai and Blut, and the wandering streets of Malo, where priests propitiate the avalanche with wine and maize. Then the night came down over the plains of Tlun, and we saw the lights of Cappadarnia. We heard the path knights beating upon drums as we passed Imaut and Golzunda. Then all but the helmsman slept. And villages scattered along the banks of the Yann heard all that night in the helmsman's unknown tongue the little songs of cities that they know not. I awoke before dawn with a feeling that I was unhappy before I remembered why. Then I recalled by the evening of the approaching day, according to all foreseen probabilities, we should come to Bar Wel Yann, and I should part from the captain and his sailors. And I had liked the man because he had given me of his yellow wine that was set apart among his sacred things, and many a story he had told me about his fair Belzoond between the Acrocian hills and the Yann Min. And I had liked the ways that his sailors had, and the prayers that they prayed at evening side by side, grudging not one another their alien gods. And I had a liking too for the tender way in which they often spoke of Durl and Duz, for it is good that men should love their native cities and the little hills that hold those cities up. And I had come to know who would meet them when they returned to their houses, and where they thought the meetings would take place, some in a valley of the Acrocian hills where the road comes up from Yann, others in the gateway of one or another of the three cities, and others by the fireside in the home. And I thought of the danger that had menaced us all alike outside Perdóndaris, a danger that, as things have happened, was very real. And I thought, too, of the helmsman's cheery song in the cold and lonely night, and how he had held our lives in his careful hands. And as I thought of this, the helmsman ceased to sing, and I looked up and saw a pale light had appeared in the sky, and the lonely night had passed, and the dawn widened, and the sailors awoke. And soon we saw the tide of the sea himself advancing resolute between Yann's borders, and Yann sprang lithely at him, and they struggled a while. Then Yann and all that was his were pushed back northwards, so that the sailors had to hoist the sails, and the wind being favourable, we still held onwards. And we passed Gondara and Narl and Hoz, and we saw memorable holy Golnuz, and heard the pilgrims praying. When we awoke after the midday rest, we were coming near to Nen, the last of the cities of the river Yann. And the jungle was all about us once again, and about Nen, but the great Maloon ranges stood up over all things and watched the city from beyond the jungle. Here we anchored, and the captain and I went into the city and found that the wanderers had come into Nen. And the wanderers were a weird, dark tribe that once in every 7 years came down from the peaks of Maloon, having crossed by a pass that is known to them from some fantastic land that lies beyond. And the people of Nen were all outside their houses, and all stood wondering at their own streets. For the men and women of the wanderers had crowded all the ways, and everyone was doing some strange thing. Some danced astounding dances that they had learned from the desert wind, rapidly curving and swirling till the eye could follow no longer. Others played upon instruments beautiful wailing tunes that were full of horror, which souls had taught them lost by night in the desert, that strange far desert from which the wanderers came. None of their instruments were such as were known in Nen, nor in any part of the region of the Yann. Even the horns out of which some were made were of beasts that none had seen along the river, for they were barbed at the tips. And they sang, in the language of none, songs that seemed to be akin to the mysteries of night and to the unreasoned fear that haunts dark places. Bitterly all the dogs of Nen distrusted them, and the wanderers told one another fearful tales. For though no one in Nen knew aught of their language, yet they could see the fear on the listeners' faces as the tale wound on. The whites of their eyes showed vividly in terror as the eyes of some little beast whom the hawk has seized. Then the teller of the tale would smile and stop, and another would tell his story, and the teller of the first tale's lips would chatter with fear. And if some deadly snake chanced to appear, the wanderers would greet him like a brother, and the snake would seem to give his greetings to them before he passed on again. Once, that most fierce and lethal of tropic snakes, the giant Lythra, came out of the jungle and all down the street, the central street of Nen, and none of the wanderers moved away from him, but they all played sonorously on drums, as though he had been a person of much honour, and the snake moved through the midst of them and smote none. Even the wanderers' children could do strange things, for if any one of them met with a child of Nen, the two would stare at each other in silence with large grave eyes. Then the wanderer's child would slowly draw from his turban a live fish or snake, and the children of Nen could do nothing of that kind at all. Much I should have wished to stay and hear the hymn with which they greet the night, that is answered by the wolves on the heights of Maloon, but it was now time to raise the anchor again, that the captain might return from Bar Wul Yann upon the landward tide. So we went on board and continued down the Yann, and the captain and I spoke little, for we were thinking of our parting, which should be for long, and we watched instead the splendour of the westerning sun. For the sun was a ruddy gold, but a faint mist cloaked the jungle, lying low, and into it poured the smoke of the little jungle cities, and the smoke of them met together in the midst and joined into one haze, which became purple, and was lit by the sun, as the thoughts of men become hallowed by some great and sacred thing. Sometimes one column from a lonely house would rise up higher than the city's smoke, and gleam by itself in the sun. And now, as the sun's last rays were nearly level, we saw the sight that I had come to see. For from two mountains that stood on either shore, two cliffs of pink marble came out into the river, all glowing in the light of the low sun, and they were quite smooth and of mountainous altitude, and they nearly met, and Yann went tumbling between them and found the sea. And this was Bar Wul Yann, the gate of Yann, and in the distance through that barrier's gap I saw the azure indescribable sea, where little fishing boats went gleaming by. And the sunset and the brief twilight came, and the exultation of the glory of Bar Wul Yann was gone. Yet still the pink cliffs glowed, the fairest marvel that the eye beheld, and this in a land of wonders. And soon the twilight gave place to the coming out of stars, and the colours of Bar Wul Yann went dwindling away. And the sight of those cliffs was to me as some chord of music that a master's hand had launched from the violin, and which carries to heaven of faery the tremulous spirits of men. And now by the shore they anchored and went no farther, for they were sailors of the river and not of the sea, and knew the Yann but not the tides beyond. And the time was come when the captain and I must part, he to go back again to his fair Belzoond in sight of the distant peaks of the Yann Min, and I to find my way by strange means back to those hazy fields that all poets know, wherein stand small mysterious cottages, through whose windows, looking westwards, you may see the fields of men, and looking eastwards see glittering elfin mountains, tipped with snow, going range on range into the region of myth, and beyond it into the kingdom of fantasy, which pertain to the lands of dream. Long we should meet no more, for my fancy is weakening as the years slip by, and I go ever more seldom into the lands of dream. Then we clasped hands, uncouthly on his part, for it is not the method of greeting in his country, and he commended my soul to the care of his own gods, to his little lesser gods, the humble ones, to the gods that bless Belzoond. End of section 13. Section 14 of Tales of Three Hemispheres. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ed Humpal. Tales of Three Hemispheres by Lord Dunsany. Beyond the Fields We Know. Second tale. A Shop in Go-By Street. I said I must go back to Yann again, and see if the bird of the river still plies up and down, and whether her bearded captain commands her still, or whether he sits in the gate of fair Belzoond, drinking at evening the marvellous yellow wine that the mountaineer brings down from the Yann Min. And I wanted to see the sailors again, who came from Durl and Duz, and to hear from their lips what befell Perdóndaris when its doom came up without warning from the hills, and fell on that famous city. And I wanted to hear the sailors pray at night, each to his own god, and to feel the wind of the evening coolly arise when the sun went flaming away from that exotic river. For I thought never again to see the tide of the Yann, but when I gave up politics not long ago, The wings of my fancy strengthened, though they had erstwhile drooped, and I had hopes of coming behind the east once more, where Yann, like a proud white war horse, goes through the lands of dream. Yet I had forgotten the way to those little cottages on the edge of the fields we know, whose upper windows, though dim with antique cobwebs, look out on the fields we know not, and are the starting point of all adventure in the lands of dream. I therefore made enquiries, and so I came to be directed to the shop of a dreamer, who lives not far from the embankment in the city. Among so many streets as there are in the city, it is little wonder that there is one that has never been seen before. It is named Go-by Street, and runs out of the Strand, if you look very closely. Now, when you enter this man's shop, you do not go straight to the point, but you ask him to sell you something, and if it is anything with which he can supply you, he hands it to you and wishes you good morning. It is his way. And many have been deceived by asking for some unlikely thing, such as the oyster shell from which was taken one of those single pearls that made the gates of heaven in Revelations, and finding that the old man had it in stock. He was comatose when I went into the shop. His heavy lids almost covered his little eyes. He sat, and his mouth was open. I said, "I want some Abama and Parfa, rivers of Damascus." "How much?" he said. 2½ yards of each, to be delivered to my flat." "That is very tiresome," he muttered. "Very tiresome. We do not stock it in that quantity." "Then I will take all you have," I said. He rose laboriously and looked among some bottles. I saw one labelled Nilos, River of Aegyptos, and others Holy Ganges, Phlegethon, Jordan. I was almost afraid he had it, when I heard him mutter again, "This is very tiresome." And presently he said, "We are out of them." "Then," I said, "I wish you to tell me the way to those little cottages in whose upper chambers poets look out upon the fields we know not, for I wish to go into the land of dream, and to sail once more upon mighty sea-like Yann." At that he moved heavily and slowly in way-worn carpet slippers, panting as he went, to the back part of his shop, and I went with him. This was a dingy lumber room full of idols. The near end was dingy and dark, but the far end was a blue cerulean glow in which stars seemed to be shining and the heads of the idols glowed. "This," said the fat old man in carpet slippers, "is the heaven of the gods who sleep." I asked him what gods slept, and he mentioned names that I had never heard, as well as names that I knew. "All those," he said, "that are not worshipped now are asleep." "Then time does not kill the gods?" I said to him, and he answered, "No. But for 3 or 4 thousand years a god is worshipped, and for 3 or 4 he sleeps. Only time is wakeful always." "But they teach us of new gods," I said to him. "Are they not new?" "They hear the old ones stirring in their sleep, being about to wake, because the dawn is breaking and the priests crow. These are the happy prophets. Unhappy are they that hear some old god speak while he sleeps, still being deep in slumber, and prophesy, and no dawn comes. They are those that men stone, saying, 'Prophesy where this stone shall hit you, and this.'" "Then time never slays the gods," I said. And he answered, "They shall die by the bedside of the last man. Then time shall go mad in his solitude, and shall not know his hours from his centuries of years, and they shall clamour round him crying for recognition, and he shall lay his stricken hands on their heads, and stare at them blindly, and say, 'My children, I do not know you from one another.' And at these words of time empty worlds shall reel." And for some while then I was silent, for my imagination went out into those far years, and looked back at me, and mocked me, because I was the creature of a day. Suddenly I was aware by the old man's heavy breathing that he had gone to sleep. It was not an ordinary shop. I feared lest one of his gods should wake and call for him. I feared many things, it was so dark, and one or two of those idols were something more than grotesque. I shook the old man hard by one of his arms. "Tell me the way to the cottages," I said, "on the edge of the fields we know." "I don't think I can do that," he said. "Then supply me," I said, "with the goods." That brought him to his senses. He said, "You go out by the back door and turn to the right." And he opened a little old dark door in the wall, through which I went, and he wheezed and shut the door. The back of the shop was of incredible age. I saw in antique characters upon a mouldering board, "Licensed to sell weasels and jade earrings." The sun was setting now, and shone on little golden spires that gleamed along the roof, which had long ago been thatched, and with a wonderful straw. I saw that the whole of Go-by Street had the same strange appearance when looked at from behind. The pavement was the same as the pavement of which I was weary, and of which so many thousand miles lay the other side of those houses, but the street was of the most pure untrampled grass, with such marvellous flowers in it that they lured downward from great heights the flocks of butterflies as they travelled by, going I know not whence. The other side of the street was a pavement again, but no houses of any kind, and what there was in place of them I did not stop to see, for I turned to my right and walked along the back of Go-by Street till I came to the open fields and the gardens of the cottages that I sought. Huge flowers went up out of these gardens like slow rockets, and burst into purple blooms, and stood there huge and radiant on 6-foot stalks, and softly sang strange songs. Others came up beside them, and bloomed, and began singing too. A very old witch came out of her cottage by the back door, and into the garden in which I stood. "What are these wonderful flowers?" I said to her. "Hush, hush," she said, "I am putting the poets to bed. These flowers are their dreams." And in a lower voice I said, "What wonderful songs are they singing?" And she said, "Be still and listen." And I listened, and found they were singing of my own childhood, and of things that happened there so far away that I had quite forgotten them till I heard the wonderful song. "Why is the song so faint?" I said to her. "Dead voices," she said, "dead voices," and turned back again to her cottage, saying, "Dead voices," still, but softly for fear she should wake the poets. "They sleep so badly while they live," she said. I stole on tiptoe upstairs to the little room, from whose windows, looking one way, we see the fields we know, and looking another, those hilly lands that I sought. Almost I feared not to find them. I looked at once toward the mountains of Faery. The afterglow of the sunset flamed on them, their avalanches flashed on their violet slopes, coming down tremendous from emerald peaks of ice. And there was the old gap in the blue-grey hills, above the precipice of amethyst, whence one sees the lands of dream. All was still in the room where the poets slept when I came quietly down. The old witch sat by a table with a lamp, knitting a splendid cloak of gold and green for a king that had been dead 1,000 years. "Is it any use," I said, "to the king that is dead that you sit and knit him a cloak of gold and green?" "Who knows?" she said. "What a silly question to ask," said her old black cat, who lay curled by the fluttering fire. Already the stars were shining on that romantic land when I closed the witch's door. Already the glowworms were mounting guard for the night around those magical cottages. I turned and trudged for the gap in the blue-grey mountains. Already when I arrived, some colour began to show in the amethyst precipice below the gap, though it was not yet morning. I heard a rattling, and sometimes caught a flash, from those golden dragons far away below me, that are the triumph of the goldsmiths of Street.to, and were given life by the ritual incantations of the conjurer Amargrarn. On the edge of the opposite cliff, too near I thought for safety, I saw the ivory palace of Singanee, the mighty elephant hunter. Small lights appeared in windows, the slaves were awake, and beginning with heavy eyelids the work of the day. And now a ray of sunlight topped the world. Others than I must describe how it swept from the amethyst cliff, the shadow of the black one that opposed it, how that one shaft of sunlight pierced the amethyst for leagues, and how the rejoicing colour leapt up to welcome the light and shot back a purple glow on the walls of the palace of ivory, while down in that incredible ravine the golden dragons still played in the darkness. At this moment a female slave came out by a door of the palace and tossed a basket full of sapphires over the edge. And when day was manifest on those marvellous heights, and the flare of the amethyst precipice filled the abyss, then the elephant hunter arose in his ivory palace, and took his terrific spear, and going out by a landward door, went forth to avenge Perdóndaris. I turned then and looked upon the lands of dream, and the thin white mist that never rolls quite away was shifting in the morning. Rising like isles above it, I saw the hills of Hap, and the city of copper, old, deserted, Bethmora, and Utnarkehi, and Kif, and Mandaroon, and the wandering leagues of Yann. Rather I guessed than saw the Yann Min, whose imperturbable and aged heads scarce recognize for more than clustered mounds the round Acroctian hills that are heaped about their feet and that shelter, as I remembered, Durl and Duz. But most clearly I discerned that ancient wood through which one going down to the bank of the Yann, whenever the moon is old, may come on Bird of the River, anchored there, waiting 3 days for travellers, as has been prophesied of her. And as it was now that season, I hurried down from the gap in the blue-grey hills by an elfin path that was coeval with fable, and came by means of it to the edge of the wood. Black though the darkness was in that ancient wood, the beasts that moved in it were blacker still. It is very seldom that any dreamer travelling in lands of dream is ever seized by these beasts, and yet I ran. For if a man's spirit is seized in the lands of dream, his body may survive it for many years, and well know the beasts that mouthed him far away, and the look in their little eyes, and the smell of their breath. That is why the recreation field at Hanwell is so dreadfully trodden into restless paths. And so I came at last to the sea-like flood of proud, tremendous Yann, with whom there tumbled streams from incredible lands. With these he went by singing. Singing, he carried driftwood and whole trees, fallen in far-away unvisited forests, and swept them mightily by. But no sign was there either out in the river or in the olden anchorage near by of the ship I came to see. And I built myself a hut, and roofed it over with the huge abundant leaves of a marvellous weed, and ate the meat that grows on the targar tree, and waited there 3 days. And all day long the river tumbled by, and all night long the tolulu bird sang on, and the huge fireflies had no other care than to pour past in torrents of dancing sparks, and nothing rippled the surface of the Yann by day, and nothing disturbed the tolulu bird by night. I know not what I feared for the ship I sought, and its friendly captain who came from fair Belzoond, and its cheery sailors out of Durl and Duz. All day long I looked for it on the river, and listened for it by night, until the dancing fireflies danced me to sleep. 3 times only in those 3 nights the tolulu bird was scared and stopped his song, and each time I awoke with a start, and found no ship, and saw that he was only scared by the dawn. Those indescribable dawns upon the Yann came up like flames in some land over the hills where a magician burns by secret means enormous amethysts in a copper pot. I used to watch them in wonder while no bird sang, till all of a sudden the sun came over a hill and every bird but one began to sing, and the tolulu bird slept fast, till out of an opening eye he saw the stars. I would have waited 3 more days, but on the 3rd day I had gone in my loneliness to see the very spot where I first met Bird of the River, at her anchorage with her bearded captain sitting on the deck. And as I looked at the black mud of the harbour and pictured in my mind that band of sailors whom I had not seen for 2 years, I saw an old hulk peeping out from the mud. The lapse of centuries seemed partly to have rotted and partly to have buried in the mud all but the prow of the boat, and on the prow faintly I saw a name. I read it slowly. It was Bird of the River. And then I knew that, while in Ireland and London 2 years had barely passed over my head, ages had gone over the region of Yann, and wrecked and rotted that once familiar ship, buried years ago the bones of the youngest of my friends, who so often sang to me of Durl and Duz, or told the dragon legends of Belzoond. For beyond the world we know there roars a hurricane of centuries, whose echo only troubles, though sorely, our fields, while elsewhere there is calm. I stayed a moment by that battered hulk, and said a prayer for whatever may be immortal of those who were wont to sail it down the Yann, and I prayed for them to the gods to whom they loved to pray, to the little lesser gods that bless Belzoond. Then, leaving the hut that I had built to those ravenous years, I turned my back to the Yann, and entering the forest at evening just as its orchids were opening their petals to perfume the night, came out of it in the morning, and passed that day along the amethyst gulf by the gap in the blue-grey mountains. I wondered if Singanee, that mighty elephant hunter, had returned again with his spear to his lofty ivory palace, or if his doom had been one with that of Perdóndaris. I saw a merchant at the small back door selling new sapphires as I passed the palace. Then I went on and came as twilight fell to those small cottages where the elfin mountains are in sight of the fields we know. And I went to the old witch that I had seen before, and she sat in her parlour with a red shawl round her shoulders, still knitting the golden cloak, and faintly through one of her windows the elfin mountains shone, and I saw again through another the fields we know. "Tell me something," I said, "of this strange land." "How much do you know?" she said. "Do you know that dreams are illusion?" "Of course I do," I said. "Everyone knows that." "Oh no, they don't," she said. "The mad don't know it." "That is true," I said. "And do you know," she said, "that life is illusion?" "Of course it is not," I said. "Life is real. Life is earnest." At that the witch and her cat, who had not moved from her old place by the hearth, burst into laughter. I stayed some time, for there was much that I wished to ask, but when I saw that the laughter would not stop, I turned and went away. End of section 14. Section 15 of Tales of Three Hemispheres. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ed Humpal. Tales of Three Hemispheres by Lord Dunsany. Beyond the Fields We Know. Third Tale. The Avenger of Perdóndaris. I was rowing on the Thames not many days after my return from the Yann, and drifting eastwards with the fall of the tide away from Westminster Bridge, near which I had hired my boat. All kinds of things were on the water with me, sticks drifting and huge boats, and I was watching, so absorbed in the traffic of that great river that I did not notice I had come to the city until I looked up and saw that part of the embankment that is nearest to Go-by Street. And then I suddenly wondered what befell Singanee, for there was a stillness about his ivory palace when I passed it by, which made me think that he had not then returned. And though I had seen him go forth with his terrific spear, and mighty elephant hunter though he was, yet his was a fearful quest, for I knew that it was none other than to avenge Perdóndaris by slaying that monster with the single tusk who had overthrown it suddenly in a day. So I tied up my boat as soon as I came to some steps, and landed and left the embankment, and about the third street I came to I began to look for the opening of Go-by Street. It is very narrow. You hardly notice it at first, but there it was, and soon I was in the old man's shop. But a young man leaned over the counter. He had no information to give me about the old man. He was sufficient in himself. As to the little old door in the back of the shop, we know nothing about that, sir. So I had to talk to him and humour him. He had for sale on the counter an instrument for picking up a lump of sugar in a new way. He was pleased when I looked at it, and he began to praise it. I asked him what was the use of it, and he said that it was of no use, but that it had only been invented a week ago, and was quite new, and was made of real silver, and was being very much bought. But all the while I was straying toward the back of the shop. When I inquired about the idols there, he said they were some of the season's novelties and were a choice selection of mascots. And while I made a pretense of selecting one, I suddenly saw the wonderful old door. I was through it at once, and the young shopkeeper after me. No one was more surprised than he when he saw the street of grass and the purple flowers on it. He ran across in his frock coat to the opposite pavement, and only just stopped in time, for the world ended there. Looking downward over the pavement's edge, he saw, instead of accustomed kitchen windows, white clouds and a wide blue sky. I led him to the old back door of the shop, looking pale and in need of air, and pushed him lightly, and he went limply through, for I thought the air was better for him on the side of the street that he knew. As soon as the door was shut on that astonished man, I turned to the right and went along the street till I saw the gardens and the cottages, and a little red patch moving in a garden, which I knew to be the old witch wearing her shawl. "Come for a change of illusion again?" she said. "I have come from London," I said, "and I want to see Singanee. I want to go to his ivory palace over the Elfin Mountains, where the amethyst precipice is." "Nothing like changing your illusions," she said, "or you grow tired. London's a fine place, but one wants to see the Elfin Mountains sometimes." "Then you know London?" I said. "Of course I do," she said. "I can dream as well as you. You are not the only person that can imagine London." Men were toiling dreadfully in her garden. It was in the heat of the day, and they were digging with spades. She suddenly turned from me to beat one of them over the back with a long black stick that she carried. "Even my poets go to London sometimes," she said to me. "Why did you beat that man?" I said. "To make him work," she answered. "But he is tired," I said. "Of course he is," said she. And I looked and saw that the earth was difficult and dry, and that every spadeful that the tired men lifted was full of pearls. But some men sat quite still, and watched the butterflies that flitted about the garden, and the old witch did not beat them with her stick. And when I asked her who the diggers were, she said, "These are my poets. They are digging for pearls." And when I asked her what so many pearls were for, she said, "To feed the pigs, of course." "But do the pigs like pearls?" I said to her. "Of course they don't," she said. And I would have pressed the matter further, but the old black cat had come out of the cottage and was looking at me whimsically and saying nothing, so that I knew I was asking silly questions. And I asked instead why some of the poets were idle and were watching butterflies without being beaten. And she said, "The butterflies know where the pearls are hidden, and they are waiting for one to alight above the buried treasure. They cannot dig until they know where to dig." And all of a sudden a fawn came out of a rhododendron forest and began to dance upon a disc of bronze, in which a fountain was set, and the sound of his 2 hooves dancing on the bronze was beautiful as bells. "Tea bell," said the witch, and all the poets threw down their spades and followed her into the house, and I followed them, but the witch and all of us followed the black cat, who arched his back and lifted his tail, and walked along the garden path of blue enamelled tiles, through the black thatched porch and the open oaken door, and into a little room where tea was ready. And in the garden the flowers began to sing, and the fountain tinkled on the disc of bronze. And I learned that the fountain came from an otherwise unknown sea, and sometimes it threw gilded fragments up from the wrecks of unheard of galleons, foundered in storms of some sea that was nowhere in the world, or battered to bits in wars waged with we know not whom. Some said that it was salt because of the sea, and others that it was salt with mariners' tears. And some of the poets took large flowers out of vases and threw their petals all about the room, and others talked 2 at a time, and others sang. "Why, they are only children after all," I said. "Only children," repeated the old witch, who was pouring out cowslip wine. "Only children," said the old black cat, and everyone laughed at me. "I sincerely apologize," I said. "I did not mean to say it. I did not intend to insult anyone." "Why, he knows nothing at all," said the old black cat, and everybody laughed till the poets were put to bed. And then I took one look at the fields we know, and turned to the other window that looks on the Elfin Mountains. And the evening looked like a sapphire. And I saw my way, though the fields were growing dim, and when I found it I went downstairs and through the witch's parlour, and out of doors, and came that night to the palace of Singanee. Lights glittered through every crystal slab, and all were uncurtained in the palace of ivory. The sounds were those of a triumphant dance. Very haunting indeed was the booming of a bassoon, and like the dangerous advance of some galloping beast were the blows wielded by a powerful man on the huge sonorous drum. It seemed to me as I listened that the contest of Singanee with the more than elephantine destroyer of Perdóndaris had already been set to music. And as I walked in the dark along the amethyst precipice, I suddenly saw across it a curved white bridge. It was one ivory tusk, and I knew it for the triumph of Singanee. I knew at once that this curved mass of ivory that had been dragged by ropes to bridge the abyss was the twin of the ivory gate that once Perdóndaris had, and had itself been the destruction of that once famous city, towers and walls and people. Already men had begun to hollow it and to carve human figures in life size along its sides. I walked across it, and halfway across, at the bottom of the curve, I met a few of the carvers fast asleep. On the opposite cliff of the palace lay the thickest end of the tusk, and I came down a ladder which leaned against the tusk, for they had not yet carved steps. Outside the ivory palace it was as I had supposed, and the sentry at the gate slept heavily. And though I asked of him permission to enter the palace, he only muttered a blessing on Singanee, and fell asleep again. It was evident that he had been drinking Bock. Inside the ivory hall I met with servitors, who told me that any stranger was welcome there that night, because they extolled the triumph of Singanee, and they offered me Bock to drink to commemorate the splendour, but I did not know its power, or whether a little or much prevailed over a man, so that I said I was under an oath to a god to drink nothing beautiful. And they asked me if he could not be appeased by a prayer, and I said, in no wise, and went towards the dance. And they commiserated me, and abused that god bitterly, thinking to please me thereby, and then they fell to drinking Bock to the glory of Singanee. Outside the curtains that hung before the dance, there stood a chamberlain, and when I told him that though a stranger there, yet I was well known to Mung and Shish and Kib, the gods of Pegana, whose signs I made, he bade me ample welcome. Therefore I questioned him about my clothes, asking if they were not unsuitable to so august an occasion, and he swore by the spear that had slain the destroyer of Perdóndaris that Singanee would think it a shameful thing that any stranger not unknown to the gods should enter the dancing hall unsuitably clad. And therefore he led me to another room, and took silken robes out of an old sea chest of black and seamy oak with green copper hasps that were set with a few pale sapphires, and requested me to choose a suitable robe. And I chose a bright green robe with an underrobe of light blue, which was seen here and there, and a light blue sword belt. I also wore a cloak that was dark purple with 2 thin strips of dark blue along the border, and a row of large dark sapphires sewn along the purple between them. It hung down from my shoulders behind me. Nor would the chamberlain of Singanee let me take any less than this, for he said that not even a stranger on that night could be allowed to stand in the way of his master's munificence, which he was pleased to exercise in honour of his victory. As soon as I was attired we went to the dancing hall, and the first thing that I saw in that tall scintillant chamber was the huge form of Singanee standing among the dancers, and the heads of the men no higher than his waist. Bare were the huge arms that had held the spear that had avenged Perdóndaris. The chamberlain led me to him, and I bowed, and said that I gave thanks to the gods to whom he looked for protection. And he said that he had heard my gods well spoken of by those accustomed to pray, but this he said only of courtesy, for he knew not whom they were. Singanee was simply dressed, and only wore on his head a plain gold band to keep his hair from falling over his forehead. The ends of the gold were tied in the back with a bow of purple silk. But all his queens wore crowns of great magnificence, though whether they were crowned as the queens of Singanee, or whether queens were attracted there from the thrones of distant lands by the wonder of him and the splendour, I do not know. All there wore silken robes of brilliant colours, and the feet of all were bare and very shapely, for the custom of boots was unknown in those regions. And when they saw that my big toes were deformed in the manner of Europeans, turning inwards toward the others instead of being straight, 1 or 2 asked sympathetically if an accident had befallen me. And rather than tell them truly that deforming out big toes was our custom and our pleasure, I told them that I was under the curse of a malignant god, at whose feet I had neglected to offer berries in infancy. And to some extent I justified myself, for convention is a god though his ways are evil, and had I told them the truth I would not have been understood. They gave me a lady to dance with who was of marvellous beauty. She told me that her name was Saranoora, a princess from the north, who had been sent as tribute to the palace of Singanee. And partly she danced as Europeans dance, and partly as the fairies of the waste who lure, as legend has it, lost travellers to their doom. And if I could get 30 heathen men out of fantastic lands, with their long black hair and little elfin eyes and instruments of music even unknown to Nebuchadnezzar the king, and if I could make them play those tunes that I heard in the long ivory palace on some lawn, gentle reader, at evening near your house, then you would understand the beauty of Saranoora, and the blaze of light and colour in that stupendous hall, and the lithesome movement of those mysterious queens that danced around Singanee. Then, gentle reader, you would be gentle no more, but the thoughts that run like leopards over the far free lands would come leaping into your head, even if it were London, yes, even in London. You would rise up then and beat your hands on the wall with all its pretty pattern of flowers, in the hope that the bricks might break and reveal the way to that palace of ivory by the amethyst gulf where the golden dragons are. For there have been men who have burned prisons down that the prisoners might escape, and even such incendiaries those dark musicians are who dangerously burn down custom that the pining thoughts may go free. Let your elders have no fear, have no fear. I will not play those tunes in any streets we know. I will not bring those strange musicians here. I will only whisper the way to the lands of dream, and only a few frail feet shall find the way, and I shall dream alone of the beauty of Saranoora, and sometimes sigh. We danced on and on at the will of the 30 musicians, but when the stars were paling and the wind that knew the dawn was ruffling up the edge of the skirts of night, then Saranoora, the princess of the north, led me out into a garden. Dark groves of trees were there, which filled the night with perfume and guarded night's mysteries from the arising dawn. There floated over us, wandering in that garden, the triumphant melody of those dark musicians, whose origin was unguessed even by those that dwelt there and knew the lands of dream. For only a moment once sang the Tolulu bird, for the festival of that night had scared him, and he was silent. For only a moment once we heard him singing in some far grove, because the musicians rested, and our bare feet made no sound. For a moment we heard that bird, of which once our nightingale dreamed, and handed on the tradition to his children. And Saranoora told me that they have named the bird the Sister of Song, but for the musicians, who presently played again, she said they had no name, for no one knew who they were or from what country. Then someone sang quite near us in the darkness, to an instrument of strings telling of Singanee and his battle against the monster. And soon we saw him sitting on the ground and singing to the night of that spear thrust that had found the thumping heart of the destroyer of Perdóndaris, and we stopped a while and asked him who had seen so memorable a struggle, and he answered, none but Singanee, and he whose tusk had scattered Perdóndaris, and now the last was dead. And when we asked him if Singanee had told him of the struggle, he said that that proud hunter would say no word about it, and that therefore his mighty deed was given to the poets, and become their trust for ever, and he struck again his instrument of strings, and sang on. When the strings of pearls that hung down from her neck began to gleam all over Saranoora, I knew that dawn was near, and that the memorable night was all but gone. And at last we left the garden and came to the abyss to see the sunrise shine on the amethyst cliff. And at first it lit up the beauty of Saranoora, and then it topped the world and blazed upon those cliffs of amethyst until it dazzled our eyes, and we turned from it and saw the workmen going out along the tusk to hollow it and carve a balustrade of fair professional figures. And those who had drunken Bach began to awake and to open their dazed eyes at the amethyst precipice, and to rub them and turn them away. And now those wonderful kingdoms of song that the dark musicians established all night by magical chords dropped back away to the sway of that ancient silence who ruled before the gods, and the musicians wrapped their cloaks about them and covered up their marvellous instruments and stole away to the plains, and no one dared ask them whither they went or why they dwelt there or what god they served. And the dance stopped, and all the queens departed. And then the female slave came out again by a door and emptied her basket of sapphires down the abyss as I saw her do before. Beautiful Saranoora said that those great queens would never wear their sapphires more than once, and that every day at noon a merchant from the mountains sold new ones for that evening. Yet I suspected that something more than extravagance lay at the back of that seemingly wasteful act of tossing sapphires into an abyss, for there were in the depths of it those 2 dragons of gold, of whom nothing seemed to be known. And I thought, and I think so still, that Singanee, terrific though he was in war with the elephants, from whose tusks he had built his palace, well knew and even feared those dragons in the abyss, and perhaps valued those priceless jewels less than he valued his queens, and that he to whom so many lands paid beautiful tribute out of their dread of his spear, himself paid tribute to the golden dragons. Whether those dragons had wings I could not see, nor, if they had, could I tell if they could bear that weight of solid gold from the abyss, nor by what paths they could crawl from it did I know. And I know not what use to a golden dragon should sapphires be, or a queen. Only it seemed strange to me that so much wealth of jewels should be thrown by command of a man who had nothing to fear, to fall flashing and changing their colors at dawn into an abyss. I do not know how long we lingered there, watching the sunrise on those miles of amethyst. And it is strange that that great and famous wonder did not move me more than it did. But my mind was dazzled by the fame of it, and my eyes were actually dazzled by the blaze, and, as often happens, I thought more of little things, and remember watching the daylight in the solitary sapphire that Saranoora had, and that she wore upon her finger in a ring. Then, the dawn wind being all about her, she said that she was cold, and turned back to the ivory palace. And I feared that we might never meet again, for time moves differently over the lands of dream than over the fields we know, like ocean currents going different ways and bearing drifting ships. And at the doorway of the ivory palace I turned to say farewell, and yet I found no words that were suitable to say. And often now when I stand in other lands I stop and think of many things to have said. Yet all I said was, "Perhaps we shall meet again." And she said that it was likely that we should often meet, for this was a little thing for the gods to permit, not knowing that the gods of the lands of dream have little power upon the fields we know. Then she went in through the doorway, and having exchanged for my own clothes again the raiment that the chamberlain had given me, I turned from the hospitality of mighty Singanee and set my face toward the fields we know. I crossed that enormous tusk that had been the end of Perdóndaris, and met the artists carving it as I went, and some by way of greeting as I passed extolled Singanee, and in answer I gave honour to his name. Daylight had not penetrated wholly to the bottom of the abyss, but the darkness was giving place to a purple haze, and I could faintly see one golden dragon there. Then looking once toward the ivory palace, and seeing no one at the windows, I turned sorrowfully away, and going by the way that I knew, passed through the gap in the mountains, and down their slopes, till I came again in sight of the witch's cottage. And as I went to the upper window to look for the fields we know, the witch spoke to me, but I was cross, as one newly waked from sleep, and would not answer her. Then the cat questioned me as to whom I had met, and I answered him that in the fields we know cats kept their place, and did not speak to man. And then I came downstairs and walked straight out of the door, heading for Go-by Street. "You are going the wrong way," the witch called through the window. And indeed I had sooner gone back to the ivory palace again. But I had no right to trespass any further on the hospitality of Singanee, and one cannot stay always in the lands of dream. And what knowledge had that old witch of the call of the fields we know, or the little though many snares that bind our feet therein? So I paid no heed to her, but kept on, and came to Go-by Street. I saw the house with the green door some way up the street, but thinking that the near end of the street was closer to the embankment where I had left my boat, I tried the first door I came to, a cottage thatched like the rest, with little gold spires along the roof ridge, and strange birds sitting there and preening marvellous feathers. The door opened, and to my surprise I found myself in what seemed like a shepherd's cottage. A man who was sitting on a log of wood in a low dark room said something to me in an alien language. I muttered something and hurried through to the street. The house was thatched in front as well as behind. There were not golden spires in front, no marvellous birds, but there was no pavement. There was a row of houses, byres and barns, but no other sign of a town. Far off I saw one or two little villages. Yet there was the river, and no doubt the Thames, for it was the width of the Thames and had the curves of it, if you can imagine the Thames in that particular spot without a city around it, without any bridges, and the embankment fallen in. I saw that there had happened to me permanently, and in the light of day, some such thing as happens to a man, but to a child more often, when he awakes before morning in some strange room, and sees a high grey window where a door ought to be, and unfamiliar objects in wrong places, and though knowing where he is, yet knows not how it can be that the place should look like that. A flock of sheep came by me presently looking the same as ever, but the man who led them had a wild, strange look, I spoke to him, and he did not understand me. Then I went down to the river to see if my boat was there, and at the very spot where I had left it, in the mud, for the tide was low, I saw a half-buried piece of blackened wood that might have been part of a boat, but I could not tell. I began to feel that I had missed the world. It would be a strange thing to travel from far away to see London and not be able to find it among all the roads that lead there, but I seemed to have travelled in time and to have missed it along the centuries. And when, as I wandered over the grassy hills, I came on a wattled shrine that was thatched with straw, and saw a lion in it, more worn with time than even the Sphinx at Giza, and when I knew it for one of the four in Trafalgar Square, then I saw that I was stranded far away in the future, with many centuries of treacherous years between me and anything that I had known. And then I sat on the grass, by the worn paws of the lion, to think out what to do. And I decided to go back through Go-by Street, and since there was nothing left to keep me any more to the fields we know, to offer myself as a servant in the palace of Singanee, and to see again the face of Saranoora, and those famous, wonderful, amethystine dawns upon the abyss where the golden dragons play. And I stayed no longer to look for remains of the ruins of London, for there is little pleasure in seeing wonderful things if there is no one at all to hear of them and to wonder. So I returned at once to Go-by Street, the little row of huts, and saw no other record that London had been except that one stone lion. I went to the right house this time. It was very much altered, and more like one of those huts that one sees on Salisbury Plain than a shop in the city of London. But I found it by counting the houses in the street, for it was still a row of houses, though pavement and city were gone. And it was still a shop. A very different shop to the one I knew, but things were for sale there, shepherd's crooks, food, and rude axes. And a man with long hair was there, who was clad in skins. I did not speak to him, for I did not know his language. He said to me something that sounded like Everkike. It conveyed no meaning to me, but when he looked toward one of his buns, light suddenly dawned in my mind, and I knew that England was even England still, and that still she was not conquered, and that though they had tired of London, they still held to their land, for the words that the man had said were Averkike. And then I knew that that very language that was carried to distant lands by the old triumphant Cockney was spoken still in his birthplace, and that neither his politics nor his enemies had destroyed him after all these 1,000 years. I had always disliked the Cockney dialect, and with the arrogance of the Irishman who hears from rich and poor the English of the splendour of Elizabeth. And when I heard those words my eyes felt sore as with impending tears. It should be remembered how far away I was. I think I was silent for a little while. Suddenly I saw that the man who kept the shop was asleep. That habit was strangely like the ways of a man who, if he were then alive, would be, if I could judge from the time-worn look of the lion, over 1,000 years old. But then, how old was I? It is perfectly clear that time moves over the lands of dream swifter or slower than over the fields we know. For the dead and the long dead live again in our dreams, and a dreamer passes through the events of days in a single moment of the town hall's clock. Yet logic did not aid me, and my mind was puzzled. While the old man slept, and strangely like in face he was to the old man who had shown me the first little old back door, I went to the far end of his wattled shop. There was a door of a sort on leather hinges. I pushed it open, and there I was again under the notice board at the back of the shop. At least the back of Go-by Street had not changed. Fantastic and remote though this grass street was, with its purple flowers and the golden spires, and the world ending at its opposite pavement, yet I breathed more happily to see something again that I had seen before. I thought I had lost for ever the world I knew, and now that I was at the back of Go-by Street again, I felt the loss less than when I was standing where familiar things ought to be, and I turned my mind to what was left me in the vast lands of dream, and thought of Saranoora. And when I saw the cottages again, I felt less lonely, even at the thought of the cat, though he generally laughed at the things I said. And the first thing that I saw when I saw the witch was that I had lost the world, and was going back for the rest of my days to the palace of Singanee. And the first thing she said was, "Why, you've been through the wrong door," quite kindly, for she saw how unhappy I looked. And I said, "Yes, but it's all the same street. The whole street's altered, and London's gone, and the people I used to know, and the houses I used to rest in, and everything, and I'm tired." "What did you want to go through the wrong door for?" she said. "Oh, that made no difference," I said. "Oh, didn't it?" she said, in a contradictory way. "Well, I wanted to get to the near end of the street, so as to find my boat quickly by the embankment, and now my boat, and the embankment, and... "Some people are always in such a hurry," said the old cat, and I felt too unhappy to be angry, and I said nothing more. And the old witch said, "Now, which way do you want to go?" And she was talking rather like a nurse to a small child, and I said, "I have nowhere to go." And she said, "Would you rather go home, or go to the ivory palace of Singanee?" And I said, "I've got a headache, and I don't want to go anywhere, and I'm tired of the lands of dream." "Then suppose you try going in through the right door," she said. "That's no good," I said. "Everyone's dead and gone, and they're selling buns there." "What do you know about time?" she said. "Nothing," answered the old black cat, though nobody spoke to him. "Run along," said the old witch. So I turned and trudged away to Go By Street again. I was very tired. "What does he know about anything?" said the old black cat behind me. I knew what he was going to say next. He waited a moment and then said, "Nothing." When I looked over my shoulder he was strutting back to the cottage. And when I got to Go By Street I listlessly opened the door through which I had just now come. I saw no use in doing it. I just did wearily as I was told. And the moment I got inside I saw it was the same as of old, and the sleepy old man was there who sold idols. And I bought a vulgar thing that I did not want for the sheer joy of seeing accustomed things. And when I turned from Go By Street, which was just the same as ever, the first thing that I saw was a taximeter running into a hansom cab. I took off my hat and cheered. And then I went to the embankment, and there was my boat, and the stately river was full of dirty, accustomed things. And I rode back and bought a penny paper. I had been away, it seemed, for 1 day. And I read it from cover to cover, patent remedies for incurable illnesses and all. And I determined to walk, as soon as I was rested, in all the streets I knew, and to call on all the people I had ever met, and to be content for long with the fields we know. End of section 15. End of Tales of Three Hemispheres by Lord Dunsany.